On the 12th of January 2016, King's College London played host to an event organised by the UK in a Changing Europe initiative, set up to discuss the role of the United Kingdom in the current EU climate at the start of a referendum year.
So we're trying to be an authoritative academic voice that is heard above the baying of both sides when the referendum campaign itself starts.
The day consisted of 5 panels dedicated to different aspects surrounding the issue and balanced perspectives from both pro-EU and Eurosceptic speakers. The keynote was given by none other than renowned Eurosceptic and current President for Conservatives for Britain, Lord Lawson.
This half-in, half-out relationship we have is the worst of both worlds. What I believe the British people want is a genuinely global future as a self-governing democracy. And that is not something we can have as a member of the European Union.
During his speech on the case for Brexit, he pointed out that being Eurosceptic does not necessarily mean being anti-Europe, a remark that found its way to Twitter under the hashtag UK and EU.
And I leave you with one last thought. If we had never joined the European Union, would the British people vote to join it today? The answer emphatically is no. And therefore the only rational course is to leave.
Here we are with an illustrious panel to separate the signal from the referendum noise.
The first panel, chaired by Anne McElvoy of The Economist, kicked off by discussing whether the UK gets more out of the EU than it puts in, focusing attentions on the history of the UK's relationship with Europe.
What I mean by the original sin is that...
First to give their thoughts on the matter was Eurosceptic Professor John Charmley, who surmised that we should be taking the high road and that by joining the EU we had been misled by a project engineered by elites.
The British public is sold the idea of a common market as an answer to its economic difficulties. In fact, what they get the impression of is that they have been lied to.
There has been a central problem, which is that our politicians have tended to take what I would call the low road of arguing about pounds, shillings and pence. What they have done is they have tended to deny that it was about what it was about as well, which is closer political union. I think it would have been much better and much more honest if politicians had, when Tony Benn and Enoch Powell said this is about political union, not said no it's not, said yes it is and this is why and it's a good thing for those reasons.
Following him was Dr. Piers Ludlow on negotiating entry.
Joining in 1973 is just about the worst possible time you could join, because it is of course the start of the first global recession after the Second World War. The fact that it was joining at least a decade later than it had expected to join greatly lessens its ability to shape the community in its fashion.
Panel 1 concluded with former UK diplomat and official historian of the UK and EU, Sir Stephen Wall, who examined the changing attitudes of the UK through the years from Heath to Blair.
We are, I think, the only member state for whom this issue remains an existential issue. And that, I think, does come back to a uniquely British view of sovereignty. It seems to me have to confront the fact that the Treaty on Economic and Monetary Union was made without us.
Chaired by Head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors Ali Renison, the second panel oversaw the discussion on whether the UK benefits financially or otherwise from being part of a single European market.
The exports to the EU are in relative long-term decline, and I think that's probably the best evidence there is that the single market is not working for the UK.
I'm here today to make the case that if we vote to leave the European Union, we will no longer have to send £350 million a week to Brussels. That's money that can be spent on our priorities, and we will be better off because we will have control over the laws, we'll be able to vote out politicians who make the wrong decisions, we will be safer, richer and more secure.
The 72 times we have voted against regulations in the Council of Ministers, we have been outvoted. 40 of those 72 times have happened since David Cameron became Prime Minister. What the increased frequency of our defeat shows is that we are failing to exert our influence either directly at the Council table or behind closed doors.
As the former Bank of England Governor Mervyn King put it, banks are global in life but national in death. And this problem hasn't been resolved. When banks fail, national governments always resort to national interests. The UK is the biggest global exporter of financial services. Being a member of the European Union gives the UK access to the largest single market in the world. While this has many opportunities, it also comes with a cost. There are some limitations on actions that the UK can take, and the critical question is whether those limitations would either endanger taxpayers' money or financial stability. Having some sort of international access to liquidity and resolution procedure, if you're going to be a global financial player, is pretty important. It's up to the UK to use its influence, and that means providing financial stability for UK taxpayers.
The last panel was Professor of European Law Catherine Barnard, whose presentation focused on the benefits of free movement of untaxed goods.
Think of the fact that your own kids talk about panettone as if it's something that they have every day, which indeed they do. The EU has over 50 trade agreements with which the UK obviously benefits.
Services.
The success of the UK's automotive industry is, according to the Society of Motor Manufacturers, largely attributable to UK membership.
Persons.
We reckon there's probably about 1 million migrant workers in the UK and probably about the same number of British nationals working in other member states. They are coming for work, and if benefits are available as well, great, of course, I'd take advantage of them, wouldn't you?
And capital.
At least part of it is dependent on taking advantage of EU rights, so the UK does benefit from free movement of capital too.
Panel 3 was chaired by Director of Communications for Open Europe, Nina Schick, and focused on whether or not being a member of the EU had an effect on the UK's influence overseas.
The EU agreement we have is a perfect example of a big bloc agreement, and it's immensely damaging to us.
First up was passionate Eurosceptic and Professor of Applied Economics Patrick Minford, whose key arguments centred around trade.
We are actually quite a small country in the world market. And in all the industries of the world, what happens if we leave the EU is that we face world prices. We substitute world prices for EU prices, which are distorted, of course, in favour of these protective margins. See, 40 years ago, the British economy was a terrible mess, and in a great panic, the establishment of this country thought, well, the EU is not such a mess, we better join it. Now we've discovered that actually we can run our own affairs quite well. I cannot really see why it makes much difference if we're in an alliance inside the EU or an alliance outside the EU. I imagine we will still be good friends and allies in NATO, in operations in the UN.
Next up was Charles Grant, Director of the Centre for European Reform, who based his argument on UK values and our relationship with the US.
I believe the EU does amplify and enhance and promote British interests and British values better than Britain can do on its own. But the fact that the EU does exist, and it is an important balance to the US, makes the Western global order less American than it would otherwise be. This is important for global governance, because the Americans are less committed to global governance than are the Europeans.
The EU amplifies Britain's voice in the world and allows it to promote its interests and its values more easily than it could on its own. The EU is an important pillar of the West. The West means a group of countries that are committed to democracy, the rule of law, human rights, but the EU plus the US is trying to maintain these values, and if the EU is weakened by a British departure or by other problems such as the euro crisis or refugee crises, then the EU will be less well placed to push for democracy, human rights, rule of law in international relations.
But the Europeans are there beating the drum for global governance, reminding the Americans that it's in their interests, and sometimes the Americans get the message, particularly on economic issues.
Taking a more in-depth, evidence-based look at the UK's influence on the world was Professor of Politics and International Relations Richard Whitman.
Unlike some of the topics that we've taken a look at today, I think the body of systematically organised evidence in this area is rather thinner. What's tended to attract attention has been more the sort of public pronouncements, particularly Obama's statement in July last year that remaining an EU member is the best strategy for the UK to have international influence, for example. In fact, it's really difficult to find counter examples of that of international leaders advocating the UK's exit from the EU.
Panel 4, as overseen by the Assistant Professor at London School of Economics, Dr. Sarah Hageman, saw the school's own Simon Hicks and UEA's Hussein Qasim give evidence on the extent to which the UK is marginalised in respect to the European Commission and legislative institutions.
What I wanted to try and show is that the UK's influence over the Commission has been mixed.
So far as UK influence is concerned, the picture is very, very mixed.
The Commission is often portrayed as the enemy of the UK, and what I wanted to demonstrate was that the picture is more complex than that.
Much is written, much is said about, much is spoken about the Commission, but actually there's been very little empirical research done inside the organisation.
It is true that the UK presence in the Commission has declined, and in short, there are fewer officials than there should be.
You know, those of you who've watched the Commission for many years know that even 5 or 6 years ago, if you went into a Directors General meeting and on a Thursday morning, there would be at least 5 Directors General there. That's no longer British Directors General, that's no longer the case.
But there's also a sort of deficit of representation at each level of seniority.
You'll see that for those other member states, many of them large member states, their underrepresentation at this junior level of policy administrative staff has got worse.
It's particularly serious with the senior managers. The more positive picture comes when you look at the sort of politics and policy of the Commission. And there I think the Commission really has taken on what you might describe as sort of British preferences. Although there aren't as many UK nationals within the Commission as one might expect, UK preferences have really been taken to heart by decision makers at the top of that organisation.
What has happened is the British government has allowed itself, for whatever reason, to go on record saying it's voted against the majority, more than any other member state.
What I was presenting today was research results on looking at whether the UK is marginalised in the EU institutions, focusing on the Council and the European Parliament. So the evidence from the Council suggests that, on the one hand, the UK is on the losing side in votes in the Council more than any other member state, but UK officials in the working groups of the Council are at the heart of EU decision making.
15 other member states named the UK first when asked which other member state do you talk to in the EU negotiations. And if you just run a kind of simple network map for the 3 periods of his data, 2006, 2009, 2012, the UK comes out in the middle. Every other member state wants to know what the Brits are going to do about this. What's the British position on this?
But that's largely to do with the fact that British MEPs no longer sit in the main political groups. So that's largely British Conservatives who've left the EPP on the centre-right, and a growing number of British Eurosceptic MEPs, you from UKIP, sitting in a more radical right.
I got an email from an anonymous, I will say, European Commission official. And he said the following. 20 years ago, I came to Brussels, and we, naming him and his countryfolk, were all in awe of UK political and administrative capacity, and especially the Machiavellian UKREP. The Brits were as good as or even better than the French. We used to joke that as only the French and the Brits used to run empires, their administrations just changed gear from running the world to now running the EU.
Overall, the picture I was presenting was a sort of mixed picture, but generally suggesting that over the last 10 years, the British government and British MEPs are more likely to be on the losing side than the winning side than they were 10 years ago.
Our government, for whatever reason, tried to pretend the treaties had not been changed. The treaties had been changed, their signature was on the treaties, it had been ratified by the House of Commons. They tried to pretend the treaties had not been changed.
There's no doubt that immigration will be the deciding issue in the referendum.
Heather Rolfe from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research chaired the 5th and final panel of the day, which saw Professor of EU and Human Rights Law Steve Peers and Co-Director of Open Europe Stephen Booth discuss the issues surrounding migration and border control.
The assertion that we've lost control of our borders has a kernel of truth to it, but it would not be true to say that it's fully true.
The UK has partial control of its borders. It can control the numbers of people coming from outside the EU more or less. It can't really control the numbers coming from the EU in any real way, but it can filter them out when they get to the border. We can see who has an EU passport and who doesn't, and make decisions on whether we allow in the non-EU citizens. So really it's a combination of significant degrees of control over non-EU migrants and no real control over EU migrants.
Perhaps immigration policy might not change that much actually as a result of this referendum. That would be quite interesting to see.
Stephen Booth went on to suggest that while the UK doesn't have the firmest grasp on its borders currently, things are improving, but would be made considerably worse were we to leave the EU.
The government is nominally in control of non-EU migration, but it struggled to meet its target of reducing migration to the hundreds of thousands. I mean, and it's struggled to meet it quite spectacularly. The actual risk is that we may actually lose some of the things that are actually beneficial to us in terms of the Dublin arrangements, and what attitude would France take to effectively policing our border on the other side of the Channel in Calais if we were to leave the European Union.
As well as during various breaks throughout the day, further discussions on the issues were had during the post-panel Q&As, in which the floor was thrown open to the guests and other speakers. The day concluded with a drinks reception, which provided an informal setting to reflect on the ideas put forward by the panels and explore the finer details. The hope now is that the data collected will provide a clearer picture on the state of affairs, and that more people will now not only take a greater interest, but have a deeper understanding by the start of the referendum.